When I walked into the room holding my belly, I could feel every pair of eyes on me. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times in the months since I found out I was pregnant. How proud I would be, the smiles, the congratulations. I had pictured hugs from my sisters, the quiet nods of approval from friends, and maybe a few tears of joy. But what hit me instead was laughter. Sharp, stifled, cruel laughter that cut through the air like knives. "They let her have another baby at her age," someone whispered, loud enough for me to hear. I could feel my skin crawling under their scrutiny. I was 52 years old. A lot of people had stopped expecting surprises from me years ago, but this was supposed to be different. I had thought love, commitment, and the joy of life might still have room for me, that my body and my heart were still capable of giving life. But instead, I walked into a room full of judgment, disbelief, and ridicule. I remember the moment I realized it wasn't just disbelief. It was mockery. My cousin Sherry, always quick with a joke, leaned over to my sister and whispered something, pointing at my stomach. Their giggles made me want to shrink into the corner. I forced myself to stand tall, to keep my chin lifted, and to meet the eyes of anyone who dared look at me. But it was impossible. Every glance, every smile that wasn't genuine, every tiny nod of pity seemed designed to humiliate me. I had been careful in planning this. I had bought the softest pastel dress, one that flowed over my bump without drawing attention in the wrong way. I had chosen neutral, warm colors, nothing flashy, just a gentle announcement of life growing inside me. I had wanted to celebrate, to share a moment of happiness with the people I had loved and trusted all my life. But instead, the moment had transformed into a trial I hadn't expected, a judgment I hadn't signed up for. They said she's desperate. I could hear it now, even over the polite clinking of teacups and silverware. She must be obsessed with the idea of having another child. I turned slowly, pretending not to notice, but I did notice. Every whisper carried venom. Every sideways glance reminded me that the people I thought would celebrate me were already writing me off, labeling me crazy, obsessed, desperate. Words meant to erode my confidence, to make me doubt myself. I wanted to tell them all to stop. I wanted to scream at the top of my lungs that this life inside me was real, that it belonged to me, that their opinions did not define my worth. But I didn't. I stood there, forced into silence by shock, by the sudden weight of judgment pressing down on my shoulders. The room felt smaller, tighter, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in to trap me in shame. My best friend, Melissa, was there. Or she used to be my best friend. Her eyes darted between mine and the group, not quite meeting my gaze, not daring to defend me. "Angela, are you sure?" she asked, her voice quiet, but sharp in its implication. Her question wasn't about my health or the child's health. It was about my sanity, about whether the world would ever forgive a woman like me for this. I wanted to shake her. I wanted to tell her she had no right to question me, no right to cast doubt on something that was mine, something I had carried in secret for months while I wrestled with fear, hope, and the remnants of heartbreak that had shadowed my life for years. I could feel my heart hammering, the heat of embarrassment creeping into my cheeks. And yet, beneath that embarrassment, beneath the sting of their laughter and whispers, something else stirred. A quiet, simmering determination. If they thought they could humiliate me, if they thought they could reduce me to a punchline in their little lives, they were mistaken. Every smirk, every whisper, every scoff planted a seed of resolve deep inside me. I thought about my life, the years I had poured into my work, into my family, into trying to make sense of a world that seemed to reward cruelty over kindness. I had faced disappointments before, betrayals, times when doors slammed in my face and I had been told I was too old, too stubborn, too much. But this laughter, this was personal, and I was not going to let it go unanswered. As I moved through the room, greeting people politely, nodding, smiling where I could, I noticed the way their eyes lingered on me, not with warmth, but with judgment. I noticed the way they shifted uncomfortably when I mentioned the baby, how quickly they changed the subject when I tried to share something joyful. The sting of isolation wrapped around me, but it also sharpened my focus. I realized that I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their cheers or their pats on the back. What I needed was to protect this life I carried, to honor it, and to ensure that one day, when the world had nothing left to say, the truth would stand undeniable. The cruelest moment came when my niece, barely 8 years old, tugged at my hand and asked, "Aunt Angela, will I have to call you Mommy too?" The innocence in her question was like a mirror, reflecting the absurdity of the room. The adults laughed. They laughed at her question, at my age, at the audacity they believed I had shown by becoming pregnant at this stage in life. But I looked down at her, knelt on the floor, and held her gaze. "No, sweetheart," I said gently. "You will always be my niece. But you will have a little cousin soon, someone we all get to love together." The adults' laughter faltered, just slightly, but it was enough to remind me that this was not about them. This was about the life growing inside me. Their mockery could not touch that. Their whispers could not undo what was already happening, what I had already brought into existence. And yet, their reactions marked the beginning of a long journey. The world had spoken. They doubted me, dismissed me, and laughed at my courage. And I knew in that moment that I would have to prove them wrong. Not for them, not for their approval, but for myself and for the child I carried. I left the baby shower early, not because I was defeated, but because I needed space to breathe, to collect my thoughts, and to let the fire inside me grow without restraint. I walked to my car in the fading light, the cool autumn air brushing against my face, and I let the quiet wash over me. The laughter, the whispers, the scorn. I could leave them behind. But I could not leave behind the determination they had unwittingly inspired. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, a single lamp illuminating the small space, and I wrote down every insult, every sneer, every whispered accusation I could remember. I cataloged it all, not out of obsession, but as a reminder, as proof. Because one day, I knew one day all of this would come back to them. Every eye that rolled, every word spoken behind my back, every laugh at my expense would be remembered. And when that day came, the world would see the truth, and I would have my revenge. For now, I was alone, except for the life growing quietly inside me. But even in that solitude, I felt powerful. I felt alive. I felt the beginning of something that would not only change my life, but would alter the lives of everyone who had dared to doubt me. They had laughed at me. They had whispered about my sanity. They had called me desperate. But they did not know me. They did not know what I was capable of. And one day, when the DNA results came back, when the undeniable truth could no longer be ignored, the war would begin. And I would win. After the baby shower, I thought the laughter would fade, that perhaps people would realize that my pregnancy wasn't a joke, that it wasn't some dramatic stunt meant to provoke whispers and ridicule. I was wrong. The whispers didn't just persist, they grew louder. They multiplied. I could feel them following me wherever I went, creeping into my life, insidious and poisonous, like smoke that couldn't be cleared. By the time I returned to work, the environment had shifted. My colleagues who once nodded politely now avoided eye contact, speaking in hushed tones when I entered the room. I could catch fragments of conversations, just enough to know that they were speaking about me, about my age, about my reckless decisions. Words like obsessed and desperate floated in the air as if they had always belonged there, as if I had somehow invited this scrutiny with my very existence. I had been proud of the career I had built over the years, the reputation I had painstakingly earned, and the respect I thought I had secured. But in the wake of the pregnancy announcement, it felt like I was standing on shifting sand. People who had once smiled at me in the hallway now gave only tight-lipped nods. Meetings that had been routine now carried a strange tension, as if my presence was a test of patience, a source of quiet judgment. I could feel the skepticism in their eyes, and even though no one had openly challenged me, the undercurrent was undeniable. One afternoon, my manager, someone I had trusted for over a decade, cornered me outside the elevator. She spoke softly, almost conspiratorially, as if we were the only two people in the building. "Angela, are you sure this is a good idea?" she asked, her tone more concerned than accusatory, though there was judgment hidden in the corners of her words. "I mean, it's wonderful, of course, but do you know what this could do to your reputation here?" I looked at her, measured her carefully, and replied evenly, "I know exactly what I'm doing, and I've thought about it more than you can imagine." I didn't say it out of pride. I said it out of necessity. I had learned early in life that people like her often equated caution with wisdom and judgment with superiority. I had no interest in explaining myself further. This life was mine, and I would not allow anyone to question my choices simply because they couldn't understand them. Still, the whispers persisted. By the end of that week, I knew that they were no longer contained to the workplace. I could feel the reach extending into my social circle. Friends I had known for years began offering advice I hadn't asked for, often veiled in concern. Are you sure you can handle this? It must be exhausting. Do you think it's wise at your age? The questions were relentless, each one a tiny dagger designed to plant doubt in my mind, to make me question the very decision I had fought for. But I refused to let them win. I realized that the only way to survive this storm was to understand it, to anticipate it, and to protect myself. So I began quietly documenting everything. The conversations, the laughter, the veiled comments. Every time someone made a disparaging remark, I wrote it down. Every whisper, every sideways glance, every insinuation that I was losing it went into a journal I kept hidden from prying eyes. I wanted a record, not for revenge at that moment, but for the day when the truth would have to be acknowledged, when silence would no longer suffice. I also became an observer. I watched people more carefully than I had ever done before. I noted who smiled genuinely and who offered false encouragement. I remembered the way my cousin's eyes darted when she thought I wasn't looking, how her posture shifted as if the room itself had become uncomfortable because of me. I remembered the half-smiles of my co-workers, the polite nods that concealed judgment. Every detail mattered. Every expression, every pause in conversation, every subtle tone of disbelief was a piece of a larger puzzle. It wasn't easy. The isolation weighed heavily on me. Some nights, I sat alone in my living room, the dim light casting long shadows across the walls, wondering if I had misjudged my decision, if I had misread my strength. But even in those moments of doubt, I felt the faint heartbeat of determination. This was not a battle I could walk away from. This was not a challenge I could ignore. If people wanted to cast me aside, to dismiss me, to label me with every negative word they could conjure, I would simply have to rise above them, and I would do it on my own terms. The whispers followed me home too. Calls that never quite reached me, emails that questioned my commitment and stability, even casual acquaintances who suddenly became experts on my life. I realized that the social world I had known was no longer safe. People who had once been allies were now judges, prosecutors, and critics. And the more they whispered, the more I realized the necessity of strategy. I could not fight this with emotion alone. I needed evidence. I needed proof. I needed a plan. It started with small steps. I created folders on my computer, some labeled evidence, others contacts, others notes. I began documenting every interaction that reflected doubt, every conversation that suggested I was not capable of handling my life or my pregnancy. I took screenshots of text messages, saved emails, and even recorded the subtle ways people addressed me in meetings. It felt meticulous, almost obsessive, but the obsessive part was necessary. If people wanted to treat me like I was incapable, I would treat their treatment with precision and intelligence. And then there were the silent tests I began conducting, the ways I let people reveal themselves without knowing they were being observed. I would tell small truths, measure reactions, note how they shifted, what assumptions they made. I discovered quickly who could be trusted and who was simply waiting for me to stumble. Every whispered word became a tool, every doubt a piece of leverage. I was building a foundation, not just for my own protection, but for the moment when the world could no longer ignore what was real. It was during this period that I realized just how cruel people could be, how willing they were to believe the worst about someone simply because it suited them. One evening, I overheard a neighbor talking on the phone, clearly referring to me. I heard Angela's gone completely off the rails. Can you imagine? At her age, their words stung, not because they were true, but because they were accepted without question by anyone who heard them. People were quick to believe in my instability, in my desperation. I remember sitting on my porch that night, the cool night air brushing against my face, thinking about how fragile social perception could be, how easily people's whispers could shape reality for someone like me. But I also thought about how easily perception could be shattered with truth, with proof, with undeniable evidence. And that thought became my anchor, my guide through the isolation and the scorn. As the weeks passed, the whispers grew into rumors. By now, everyone had a story about me, how I had desperately clung to youth, how I was obsessed with proving something, how I was out of control. I was shocked at first, but then I began to see the pattern. People feared what they could not control. My pregnancy was not just a personal choice. It had become a mirror reflecting their insecurities, their assumptions, and their own failures. and I realized that the power they wielded through gossip was only as strong as my willingness to let it define me. So I didn't let it. I moved through the world carefully, documenting everything, observing everyone, and fortifying my resolve. Every laugh, every whisper, every sideways glance became fuel. I imagined the day when all of this would be laid bare, when the people who had doubted me, who had called me obsessed and desperate, would have to face the consequences of their disbelief. And I smiled quietly to myself because that day was coming. By the time my pregnancy was halfway through, I had transformed. I was no longer the woman who had entered that baby shower, vulnerable and hopeful. I was something stronger. I was aware. I was vigilant. I was preparing, not just for motherhood, but for the reckoning that would inevitably follow. The whispers had underestimated me. The social scorn had underestimated me. And I would make them pay for their arrogance in the only way that mattered. By surviving, by thriving, and by making sure that the truth, when it came, would speak louder than any laughter, louder than any whisper, louder than any doubt. Because whispers, no matter how loud they grow, are powerless against evidence. And I was ready to gather mine, piece by piece, until the day came when the world could no longer deny the reality of my life, and the choices I had made unbowed, unapologetic, and unshakable. I never thought betrayal would come from someone I trusted, someone I considered family. I had always believed that blood, shared memories, and years of friendship formed an unbreakable bond. But as the weeks turned into months, I learned that loyalty was rarer than I had imagined, and that some people's desire to protect their own image and ego far outweighed any sense of decency. The betrayal struck not with a shout or a confrontation, but with subtlety, cunning, and precision. So precise that I almost missed it, almost let it slip by. It was my sister, Marlene. The woman I had shared my childhood with, who had promised to stand by me through thick and thin, who had laughed with me, cried with me, and celebrated my milestones. Marlene had always been a little competitive, a little envious, but I had never expected malice from her. Not like this. The first indication came during a family gathering. I had just returned from a routine doctor's appointment, glowing with the excitement of a healthy checkup, the reassurance that my pregnancy was progressing without complications. I told Marlene quietly, expecting a smile, maybe a hug. What I got instead was a sharp intake of breath, a glance that flickered between me and the rest of the family, and a comment that would haunt me for weeks. "Well, I hope she knows what she's doing," she said, loud enough for a few relatives to hear. Her words weren't overtly cruel, but they carried insinuation, doubt, a seed of mistrust carefully planted. At her age, this could be risky. I froze. I forced a polite nod, but inside something twisted. I had not come into this expecting coddling or praise, but I had come expecting support, the basic acknowledgement of my autonomy. Instead, Marlene had turned the room against me without lifting a finger. I didn't see it at first, but the way cousins exchanged glances, the way my niece whispered to her mother with a giggle that sounded almost like a warning, the subtle smirks on faces I had thought were friendly. It was all orchestrated, and Marlene had been the conductor. Over the next few days, I began noticing more signs. She called my workplace under the guise of concern, speaking to my colleagues in tones of feigned worry. She hinted that I might not be up to the responsibilities of pregnancy, that perhaps the stress could affect my work. Some of my coworkers, naive and eager to believe the worst, repeated her words, and soon, a subtle but damaging narrative had taken hold. By the time I walked into the office, I could feel it in the air, doubt, suspicion, a quiet judgment that I hadn't earned, but that was now being pinned on me like a brand. The betrayal stung, but worse was the knowledge that I could have seen it coming if I had been more discerning. Marlene had always enjoyed being the center of attention, the keeper of family narratives. She had always relished the power of controlling perception. But I had trusted her implicitly, believing that love and blood were shields against cruelty. That trust, I realized now, had been my greatest mistake. It wasn't just the social manipulation that hurt, it was the personal. Marlene had always been involved in my life in subtle ways, offering advice, asking about my health, checking in under the guise of concern. Each of those interactions now seemed calculated, each gesture a step toward undermining me. The realization that she had quietly, methodically orchestrated whispers, doubts, and suspicions left me reeling. It was not just betrayal. It was an attack designed to isolate me, to weaken my position, to make me question myself while the world watched and judged. For a few days, I did nothing. I retreated into a quiet space of disbelief and anger, the kind that burns silently but leaves scars. I replayed every conversation, every meeting, every phone call. I remembered her tone, her smiles, the way she had phrased questions to plant seeds of doubt. And as the anger simmered, it transformed into something sharper, something focused. I realized that this betrayal could not stand unchallenged. Not now. Not ever. I began planning silently, carefully. My first step was to gather evidence. I couldn't confront her without proof. Words would be twisted, intentions misrepresented, and the people around us would side with her if I had nothing concrete. So I documented everything. Emails, phone messages, snippets of conversations, casual remarks repeated in gatherings. I kept detailed notes of interactions, timestamps, and the people who had witnessed them. I began to track patterns. When she would speak to colleagues, when she would casually mention my pregnancy to friends, and when she would whisper doubts in the ears of family members. Every move she made, I cataloged. I also learned to observe more keenly. I watched her interactions with others, noting subtle shifts in her demeanor when she thought I wasn't paying attention. I noticed the way she smiled in a particular way when delivering a suggestion, the way she tilted her head when framing a comment as concern, and the way she laughed just a little too loudly at a joke meant to belittle me. These small behaviors, when pieced together, formed a clear picture of intent, a pattern of calculated betrayal. At the same time, I cultivated patience. I learned that the most powerful strategies are often invisible, slow-moving, and precise. I could not act impulsively. If I did, Marlene would anticipate my reaction, and she would twist the story to make me the aggressor, the hysterical one, the desperate woman she had painted me to be. No, this had to be different. This had to be meticulous, deliberate, and undeniable. There were moments, of course, when the weight of betrayal threatened to overwhelm me. Nights when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining confrontations, imagining the look on her face when I revealed everything I knew, everything I had documented. I imagined her shock, her rage, the disbelief that someone she had underestimated could rise above her manipulation. But I also restrained myself. I reminded myself that this was not about emotion. It was about strategy. Patience and precision would be my allies. I also began strengthening my support network quietly. I reached out to friends and family who had shown genuine concern, who had never wavered in their belief in me. I shared carefully selected details with them, not for validation, but to ensure that when the time came, I would have witnesses who could corroborate the truth. I cultivated trust, deliberately and cautiously, knowing that the world I had once taken for granted could no longer be relied upon. As the months passed, Marlene's subtle attacks continued, but I was no longer their victim. Each whisper, each hint of doubt, each manipulation only reinforced my resolve. I watched her carefully, documented her patterns, and waited. I became a silent observer, a quiet strategist, knowing that the eventual reckoning would be mine to deliver. I also reflected on the nature of betrayal itself. I realized that true betrayal comes not from strangers or casual acquaintances, but from those who know your heart, who understand your vulnerabilities, who should, by every measure, protect you. And perhaps that realization was what gave me the greatest clarity. If someone as close as Marlene could betray me, then I could no longer depend on anyone but myself. My strength, my intelligence, my vigilance, that was all I could trust. And it was more than enough. By the time my pregnancy reached its third trimester, I had transformed completely. The woman who had once been shocked, hurt, and humiliated by whispers and doubt had become something different. I had become calculated, deliberate, and unflinchingly observant. I knew that the betrayal I had suffered was not a dead end. It was an opportunity, a catalyst for strategy and planning. And I knew deep in my heart that the day of reckoning was approaching. Because betrayal, I realized, is not just an end. It is a beginning. And Marlene, with all her cunning, her subtle manipulations, and her carefully concealed envy, had unwittingly set the stage for my own rise. She had underestimated me, as everyone else had. She had whispered lies into the ears of those around me, thinking she could control the narrative. But I had learned, with painful clarity, that narratives are only powerful when left unchallenged. And I was ready to challenge hers, piece by piece, with precision, patience, and the undeniable truth. By the time I felt the first faint movements of my child, the first fluttering kicks beneath my hands, I realized that I had a new reason to fight. This was not just about me anymore. This was about protecting the future, about securing a life that belonged to me and my child, about ensuring that the whispers of betrayal and doubt would never have the final word. And I vowed, silently and without hesitation, that the woman who had undermined me, who had betrayed me, would one day face the consequences of her actions in a way she could not escape, explain away, or manipulate. And so, as the months passed, I continued my quiet work. I documented, I observed, I waited. The betrayal I had suffered had ignited something fierce inside me, a determination that would not be denied. Marlene had thought she had weakened me. She had thought she had gained the upper hand. But she had done nothing of the sort. She had only revealed her own weaknesses. And in doing so, she had prepared me for the day when truth, evidence, and undeniable proof would turn the tables completely. The seeds of the war to come were planted quietly, silently, meticulously. And when the time was right, they would bloom with a force that no whisper, no lie, and no betrayal could withstand. I held the small envelope in my hands as if it were a fragile treasure, the weight of it far heavier than its size suggested. I had been waiting for this moment for weeks, every day stretching into an eternity, each hour a slow, painful tick of anticipation. The DNA test results were finally in. The proof that would confirm the truth, expose the lies, and shut down the whispers once and for all. It had taken everything I had to get to this point. The whispers, the laughter, the insinuations that I was desperate, obsessed, or even delusional. Every one of them had built a quiet, simmering storm inside me. And now, in my hands, I held the key to calm it, to transform it into something powerful. I could finally breathe. But first, I had to face the tension, the unbearable weight of not knowing. Weeks ago, when I first decided to pursue the test, I had kept it a secret. Not even Marlene knew. I had arranged everything discreetly, under the guise of routine checkups and private appointments. There was no way I could risk anyone sabotaging this moment. No way I could let a single whisper or suspicion disrupt the final piece of the puzzle. The laboratory that performed the tests was meticulous. Every swab, every sample was handled with care. The process had taken time, each passing day a silent torment as I imagined the worst. What if there was a mistake? What if the results didn't prove what I knew in my heart to be true? I had always trusted my instincts, always trusted what I knew to be real. But the weeks of waiting tested even that trust. Every time my phone rang, my heart leapt. Every envelope that arrived in the mail made me tense with anticipation, only to be disappointed when it contained bills, advertisements, or letters unrelated to the test. The emotional roller coaster had left me exhausted, but nothing could compare to the mixture of fear and hope I felt now. Sitting at my kitchen table, the envelope before me, I felt a strange quiet settle over the room. The world outside continued as usual. Cars passing by, neighbors chatting, the hum of life. But inside, time seemed to have stopped. I hesitated, my fingers trembling slightly as I considered opening it. For a fleeting moment, I wondered if I could wait until morning, if I could delay the inevitable confrontation with reality. But I knew that hesitation would only prolong the tension, only give the whispers more room to fester in my mind. So I tore the envelope open, slowly, deliberately, as if the pace of my hands could somehow control the outcome. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the weight of its importance pressing down on me. I unfolded it carefully, my eyes scanning the printed words, taking in the numbers, the results, the confirmation that would change everything. And then the results were clear, unequivocal, undeniable. The child I carried was his. There was no room for doubt, no ambiguity, no interpretation that could twist the truth. Every whisper of disbelief, every laugh, every judgmental glance that had haunted me for months was silenced in an instant. The validation was overwhelming, a tidal wave of relief, pride, and quiet satisfaction that I had never known. I sat back in my chair, the paper trembling slightly in my hands, and allowed myself a moment of reflection. I thought about the people who had doubted me, who had labeled me obsessed, desperate, or crazy. I thought about Marlene, whose betrayal had cut deeper than any insult or rumor. I thought about the colleagues who had whispered behind my back, the friends who had questioned my judgment, the family members who had exchanged knowing glances at the baby shower. And I realized, with a quiet, almost terrifying clarity, that the power had shifted. For months, I had been on the defensive, carefully observing, documenting, and planning. I had been the target of speculation, ridicule, and subtle manipulation. But now, with this single piece of evidence, everything had changed. The whispers no longer had power. The laughter no longer had weight. The doubt that had been poured over me like acid had been neutralized by the undeniable truth. I was vindicated. There was a strange satisfaction in knowing that the very people who had attempted to undermine me, who had tried to diminish my worth, who had whispered and judged and laughed, would now have to confront reality. The truth could not be ignored, twisted, or silenced. The DNA results were objective, scientific, indisputable, and they were mine to wield. I thought about the moments leading up to this revelation. The isolation, the betrayal, the long nights spent cataloging every whisper and smile, every subtle manipulation. I had been careful, deliberate, patient. And now, the reward for that patience was more than personal validation. It was power. The power to confront those who had doubted me with evidence they could not refute. But even in the satisfaction, I felt a quiet restraint. This was not a time for reckless celebration. The war, as I had come to think of it, was only beginning. The DNA results were the first strike, the undeniable proof that would give me leverage, credibility, and confidence. What came next required precision, strategy, and patience. I could feel the quiet satisfaction of victory in my chest, tempered by the knowledge that I had to proceed carefully. I remembered the early days of this journey, the baby shower where laughter had cut through me like a blade, the whispers that followed me into every room, the betrayal of someone I had trusted more than anyone. All of it had led to this moment, the moment when evidence, truth, and patience converged to create a weapon more powerful than anger or rhetoric. I had been vindicated, and yet the real work was just beginning. I carefully placed the test results in a folder I had prepared for this very purpose. It was a thick, unassuming folder, labeled simply, with no indication of the explosive power contained within. I had learned over the past months that appearances were deceiving, that subtlety often carried more weight than overt confrontation. This folder, innocuous as it seemed, was the first step in reclaiming the narrative, in exposing the truth to those who had tried to rewrite it. And I began to plan. I thought about the conversations that would unfold when the results were revealed. I thought about Marlene, who had undermined me so thoroughly, and the moment she would realize that her whispers and manipulations had been catalogued, recorded, and would be exposed. I thought about the colleagues who had doubted my capabilities, the friends who had questioned my judgment, the family members who had whispered about my sanity. All of them would have to confront a reality they had worked so hard to ignore. I felt a sense of calm power settle over me. For the first time in months, I was no longer reacting. I was no longer on the defensive. I had the truth, and with the truth came authority. The whispers could no longer shape my world. The laughter could no longer wound me. The doubts that had haunted me could no longer linger. And I realized with a quiet, fierce satisfaction that the world would finally have to listen. The next days were a careful orchestration. I shared the results selectively, with those who had doubted me the most, with those whose judgments had weighed heaviest on my mind. The reactions were instantaneous. Shock, disbelief, embarrassment, and eventually silence. The words that had been used to undermine me were rendered powerless by the objective truth. The laughter that had once seemed so sharp now fell flat, replaced by the recognition that I had been right all along. And in that silence, I found a new kind of strength. The vindication was not just personal. It was a declaration, a statement that I would not be dismissed, mocked, or doubted. I had faced whispers, ridicule, and betrayal, and I had emerged unscathed, armed with truth and fortified by patience. The DNA results were more than proof. They were a catalyst, a turning point that would shape the next chapter of my life. As I reflected on the journey that had brought me here, I felt a sense of closure for the fear, the isolation, and the betrayal I had endured. But closure was not enough. Vindication demanded action. The people who had underestimated me, who had whispered, laughed, and doubted, would soon understand that truth is more powerful than rumor, and that patience, combined with evidence, can change the course of any story. The DNA results had shattered the lies. They had silenced the whispers. They had exposed the betrayal. And for the first time in months, I felt a profound sense of control, a clarity that came not from emotion but from knowledge, strategy, and unassailable truth. I had been tested, and I had passed. I had been doubted, and I had been proven right. The next phase was clear. The war that had begun with whispers, betrayal, and judgment would continue, but now it would be waged on my terms. The power had shifted. The evidence was undeniable, and I knew with certainty that no one who had mocked, doubted, or betrayed me would ever be able to deny the reality of what had transpired. I folded the results carefully, placing them back in the folder. I closed it, aware that this was not the end, but the beginning of the reckoning. The whispers had been silenced. The laughter had been muted. The betrayal had been exposed. And now, the world would have to witness the consequences. I smiled quietly to myself, the first genuine smile I had felt in months. The tension, the uncertainty, and the fear were gone, replaced by a calm, deliberate satisfaction. The truth was on my side. The evidence was mine. And the war, when it came, would be fought with patience, precision, and the certainty of victory. Because the DNA had spoken, the lies had fallen, and I had finally been vindicated. Holding the DNA results in my hand was like holding a key, one that unlocked more than just truth. It unlocked power. It unlocked the ability to step out of the shadows that had kept me cowering, silent, and second-guessing myself for months. I had been mocked, whispered about, and betrayed. I had endured laughter, condescension, and the cold stares of people who thought they were above me. But now, with proof in my possession, I realized I could rise. Slowly, deliberately, I began to reclaim the life that had been overshadowed by doubt and cruelty. I started with subtlety, the same precision I had learned during the months of observation and careful documentation. There was no need for grand displays of anger or public accusations. The people who had doubted me were already vulnerable, uncomfortable in the knowledge that they had been wrong, that I had been right all along. My task was to expose their hypocrisy without appearing vengeful, without giving them the chance to spin the story. The first confrontation was at a small family gathering. I had prepared for this moment mentally for weeks, rehearsing the calm, measured tone I would adopt. Marlene was there, smiling in her usual way, a smile I now recognized as brittle and performative. The air was light with small talk and laughter, but I felt the tension underneath, like a taut string waiting to snap. I waited until the conversation naturally shifted to my pregnancy, and I let the moment unfold. I thought I should share something. I began quietly, my voice steady, commanding just enough attention without shouting. I reached into my bag and produced the folder with the DNA results. The movement was deliberate, casual even, but the presence of the folder in my hands was enough to make the room still. I looked at Marlene, then at the other family members, letting the silence stretch. Their eyes, previously so confident and dismissive, now held uncertainty, a flicker of unease that thrilled me silently. This, I continued, placing the folder on the table between us, confirms everything. There is no room for speculation, doubt, or judgment. The truth is clear. I didn't need to elaborate. The results were self-explanatory, precise, scientific. The whispers that had followed me, the laughter that had cut me down, the insinuations of desperation and obsession. All of it now stood exposed for what it truly was, baseless, cruel, and hypocritical. The reactions were instantaneous. Marlene's face flushed, a mixture of shock and anger passing across her features. She opened her mouth to speak, but faltered, caught off guard by the undeniable proof. Other family members shifted in their seats, some avoiding eye contact, others staring at me with the faintest trace of guilt. Even those who had not actively participated in the whispers felt the weight of their silence, realizing that they had allowed cruelty to flourish unchecked. I remained calm. I let the silence do the work for me. In that moment, I didn't need to speak more. The truth had spoken. The DNA results had done what my words never could. They had validated me, elevated me, and dismantled the facade of judgment and mockery that had surrounded me for so long. From that day forward, I noticed subtle changes in the way people approached me. Those who had whispered now tread carefully, hesitant to speak, as if their words could undo themselves. I could feel the respect slowly returning, cautiously at first, then with more confidence. The power of proof had transformed the dynamics around me. I no longer had to justify myself. The results had done it for me. At work, the impact was just as pronounced. Colleagues who had questioned my ability, who had doubted my capacity to handle both my career and my pregnancy, now approached me with deference. Meetings were different. My opinions were valued, my suggestions taken seriously. I could see the quiet recalibration of attitudes, the subtle acknowledgement that I had not only survived but thrived under circumstances they had assumed would weaken me. I took deliberate steps to solidify this regained power. I organized meetings with key colleagues, sharing insights and strategic plans that reflected both my professional expertise and my unwavering focus. I made sure my presence was felt, not through aggression or confrontation, but through competence and clarity. Every project I led, every decision I made, carried the weight of someone who had endured scrutiny, betrayal, and doubt, and had emerged stronger. In my personal life, the transformation was equally profound. Friends who had offered genuine support grew closer, their loyalty validated by the vindication I had achieved. Those who had mocked or distanced themselves were quietly edged out, no confrontation necessary. I had learned the power of selective engagement, of surrounding myself only with those who elevated rather than undermined. The whispers of the past became a silent measure of my growth, a reminder of how far I had come. Marlene, of course, continued to be a challenge. Her initial shock had faded into thinly veiled resentment. She spoke to me with a forced politeness that barely concealed the irritation she felt at being outmaneuvered without public confrontation. I let her stew, knowing that the most effective revenge is often patience and visibility, the subtle demonstration of competence and truth that she could neither dispute nor counteract. Every polite interaction, every calm response, reinforced the reality that she had underestimated me, and that mistake would cost her more than she could imagine. There were moments when I reflected on the months of hardship, the loneliness, the betrayal, and the ridicule. The memory of the baby shower, the whispers at work, the manipulations at home. They all resurfaced, each one a reminder of the stakes I had faced. But now, those memories served a different purpose. They were no longer sources of pain or shame. They were proof of my resilience, evidence of my strength, and fuel for the careful strategy one had deployed to rise above them. I also began to reclaim my own sense of identity, beyond the vindication and exposure of others. I focused on my health, on preparing for motherhood, and on nurturing the life growing within me. The pregnancy, once a source of whispered criticism and disbelief, became a source of empowerment. Every kick, every movement, every heartbeat reminded me that I had not only endured but had triumphed. The child I carried was a living testament to my courage and determination, a symbol of my ability to rise from shadows into light. Socially, I became more assertive in curating my environment. I chose gatherings carefully, surrounding myself with people who supported rather than judged. I no longer tolerated whispers or subtle undermining. When small hints of doubt or malice surfaced, I addressed them calmly and directly, using the proof I had to reinforce my position. The once overwhelming power of rumor had been neutralized, replaced by the undeniable authority of truth. Rebuilding my reputation also involved reclaiming my voice publicly. I began sharing aspects of my journey with close friends and colleagues, framing the narrative in a way that highlighted resilience, intelligence, and dignity. I did not dwell on anger or vengeance. Instead, I focused on lessons learned, strength gained, and the empowerment that comes from enduring scrutiny and betrayal with grace. This approach not only solidified my position, but also ensured that my vindication was recognized as both personal and public, a transformation rooted in evidence and integrity rather than mere defiance. By the time my child was born, I had fully emerged from the shadows. The room that had once been filled with laughter at my expense now held admiration, respect, and quiet acknowledgement of the journey I had undertaken. I had regained control, not just over my life, but over the narrative itself. The people who had doubted me could no longer define me. I had reclaimed that power, piece by piece, with patience, precision, and unwavering determination. Even Marlene, who had once wielded whispers like weapons, now had no room to maneuver. She had been outsmarted not through confrontation or aggression, but through the quiet accumulation of truth, evidence, and deliberate action. Watching her navigate the aftermath of her own miscalculations, I felt neither glee nor malice. Only the satisfaction of someone who had endured hardship and emerged stronger, smarter, and more capable than ever before. Rising from the shadows required more than vindication. It required a transformation of self. I had learned to observe carefully, to document meticulously, and to act strategically. I had learned patience in the face of betrayal and restraint in moments of potential confrontation. I had learned that power lies not in reaction, but in anticipation and deliberate action. And most importantly, I had learned that the combination of truth and perseverance is unstoppable. As I settled into this new phase of my life, I felt a profound sense of liberation. I had survived the mockery, silenced the whispers, and confronted betrayal with intelligence and strategy. I had reclaimed my reputation, rebuilt my relationships, and restored my sense of agency. The shadows that had once threatened to engulf me had been dispelled, leaving only clarity, strength, and purpose. And in that clarity, I began to see the final phase of my journey, the culmination of months of careful observation, documentation, and planning. The war that had begun with whispers, laughter, and betrayal was approaching its climax. I had risen from the shadows, but now it was time to ensure that the people who had tried to undermine me would face the full consequences of their actions. The DNA results had shattered their lies. My patience and strategy had rebuilt my life. My child, my health, my career, and my reputation were no longer vulnerable. And as I looked to the future, I knew with absolute certainty that the next steps would be deliberate, calculated, and unstoppable. Rising from the shadows had been more than a personal victory. It had been a reclamation of power, dignity, and control. And I was ready for the final act. The whispers had long since faded into silence. The laughter, once sharp and mocking, now faltered when directed at me. The betrayal that had cut deep had been catalogued, documented, and transformed into a tool far more potent than anger or confrontation. But silence alone was not enough. Vindication had given me power, yes, but the war, the deliberate, methodical dismantling of those who had humiliated me, was only beginning, and I intended to execute it with precision, patience, and unyielding intent. I had learned long ago that revenge is not about rash actions or emotional explosions. True power lies in calculation, in knowing your opponents better than they know themselves, and in striking at the precise moment when their guard is down. The months of whispers, betrayal, and ridicule had given me an education in human weakness and hypocrisy. I had observed, documented, and reflected, and now the time had come to act. The first target was Marlene. The sister who had betrayed me so quietly, so effectively, had underestimated my patience and intelligence. Her initial shock at the DNA revelation had faded, replaced by a brittle resentment that I could feel in every interaction. But she had not realized that the revelation was only the first move in a larger strategy. I had spent weeks considering how best to confront her, not with overt aggression, but with subtle exposure that would leave her powerless to deny her actions. I began by sharing selectively documented evidence with other family members. Carefully chosen snippets of her manipulations, her whispered doubts, her attempts to undermine me, were presented calmly, matter-of-factly, to those who had been affected or complicit. I didn't need to embellish or dramatize. The facts spoke for themselves. The effect was immediate. Those who had once ignored or participated in her schemes now regarded her with quiet alarm. Conversations shifted. Alliances realigned. The sister who had thought herself untouchable began to shrink under the weight of her own actions, powerless to defend herself against the clear record of her betrayal. Next, I turned my attention to colleagues who had spread rumors or questioned my stability. The subtle undermining that had made my workplace so tense for months became a tool in my hands. I presented evidence of the whispers, the selective exaggerations, and the manipulations to HR and management, ensuring that the truth could not be denied. The reactions ranged from stunned silence to cautious acknowledgement, but the result was the same. My credibility was restored, and those who had attempted to damage it were left exposed. The whispers that had once had power over me were now confined to the past, powerless in the face of documented truth. I did not rush. I knew the value of patience, of letting the impact of each revelation unfold naturally. Every person who had doubted me, every friend who had questioned my judgment, every family member who had allowed themselves to be swayed by gossip, was confronted not by my anger, but by undeniable evidence. Their discomfort, their shifting glances, their hesitant words, all were marks of my quiet triumph. I had learned to wield evidence like a scalpel, precise and clean, cutting away the falsehoods they had built around themselves. There were moments of personal satisfaction that I allowed myself privately. I would reflect on the baby shower, the laughter, the mocking whispers that had first triggered this journey. I remembered the sting, the humiliation, and the sense of isolation that had seemed unbearable at the time. and I would smile quietly, knowing that each act of patient observation, each meticulous note, each carefully planned step had led to this moment. The slow, methodical dismantling of those who had sought to diminish me. Even Marlene, the sister who had been the architect of my betrayal, could no longer maintain her facade. I watched as she struggled to navigate family events, her usual confidence replaced by a brittle caution. Every attempt she made to assert control, to regain influence, was subtly countered by the awareness that her actions were documented, that her manipulations were known, and that the people around her were no longer blind to her motives. The power she had once wielded so effortlessly was gone, dissipated by the quiet, deliberate strategy one had deployed. The culmination of my revenge was not in public shaming or humiliation. It was in the restoration of dignity, authority, and respect. Each person who had mocked me, whispered about me, or questioned my judgment was now faced with the undeniable reality. I had endured their cruelty, I had emerged stronger, and I had reclaimed control. Their laughter no longer had any effect. Their whispers no longer had any reach, and their attempts to undermine me were rendered impotent by the documentation, patience, and strategy that had guided my actions. In my professional life, the transformation was equally striking. The colleagues who had doubted me, who had questioned my ability to balance work and pregnancy, were now observers of my competence and authority. Projects that had once been fraught with tension and skepticism were now executed under my guidance with confidence and precision. Meetings flowed smoothly, ideas were acknowledged, and my expertise was respected without question. The workplace that had once been a battlefield of subtle undermining had become a stage for my triumph, a testament to the power of resilience and preparation. Socially, I reclaimed my position carefully. Friends who had offered genuine support were celebrated and nurtured, their loyalty recognized and rewarded. Those who had mocked, distanced themselves, or whispered behind my back were quietly removed from my inner circle. I learned to value quality over quantity in relationships, to surround myself only with those who elevated me rather than diminished me. The whispers of the past, once sources of pain, became benchmarks of growth and awareness, reminders that discernment and patience are vital tools in navigating a world filled with judgment and envy. Even moments that might have been emotionally challenging became opportunities to assert control. Family events, social gatherings, and workplace interactions were no longer spaces of tension and fear. I moved through them with confidence, aware of my power and the carefully laid foundations of my strategy. Every glance, every comment, every whispered thought was met with quiet awareness and measured response. I had learned that true power is often invisible, exerted not through overt aggression, but through observation, precision, and timing. And then there was the ultimate satisfaction, knowing that my child, the life that had sparked this journey, would grow up in a world where truth, patience, and resilience are more powerful than cruelty, ridicule, and betrayal. The whispers that had once surrounded me would not touch my child. The lessons I had learned, the strategy one had deployed, and the strength I had cultivated would be my legacy, a foundation upon which my family could stand with dignity and pride. In the quiet moments, I reflected on the path that had brought me here. The laughter at the baby shower, the whispers behind closed doors, the betrayal of someone I had trusted, the months of isolation and careful observation. All of it had led to this moment of quiet, deliberate triumph. I had endured, I had prepared, and I had executed a plan that ensured accountability, restored dignity, and secured my position. The war they had never seen coming was not one of anger or vengeance alone. It was one of intelligence, patience, and the strategic use of truth. By the time the final pieces of my plan were in place, I had achieved more than personal vindication. I had restored my reputation, rebuilt my relationships with those who mattered, and exposed the hypocrisy of those who had attempted to diminish me. I had moved from the shadows into the light, not through confrontation alone, but through meticulous preparation, strategic execution, and unwavering confidence in the truth. The lessons of the past months had transformed me. I had learned the power of observation, the necessity of documentation, and the value of patience. I had learned that betrayal, ridicule, and whispers, while painful, can be transformed into tools of empowerment when approached with strategy and resolve. I had learned that revenge, true revenge, is not about rage. It is about restoring balance, enforcing accountability, and demonstrating that truth, patience, and preparation are unstoppable forces. And in the final reckoning, I felt a sense of profound satisfaction. The people who had mocked me, doubted me, and betrayed me were no longer threats. Their whispers were silenced, their laughter muted, and their manipulations exposed. I had risen from the shadows, reclaimed my dignity, and ensured that the legacy I would leave, both for myself and my child, was one of strength, resilience, and unassailable truth. The war had been won not with shouting or confrontation, but with patience, strategy, and intelligence. I had navigated betrayal, survived ridicule, and transformed whispers into evidence. I had dismantled those who had humiliated me, not through brute force, but through quiet precision and calculated action. And as I looked toward the future, I knew that the foundation I had built would endure, a testament to the power of truth and resilience, a reminder that those who underestimate a determined heart do so at their own peril. I had risen from the shadows, not just to survive, but to thrive. I had reclaimed my life, my voice, and my power. And the people who had thought they could break me now understood, too late, that I was unstoppable. The war they never saw coming was complete.